This is Mae Brussell. It is tape number 849, March the 14th, 1988. Now that I'm not on the radio, not doing my radio program, I suggest that if this information that you receive on the tape is of interest to you, that in some way you make copies of the tapes for people who might listen and become informed. Always copy the bibliography sheet that accompanies the tape. Never send a tape without the bibliography sheet, but try to use the information in some way with letters to the editor, talk shows, call up, and so forth. But I depend on you now for some more activism, and if it comes from everywhere, there's less chance that one or two people can be silenced. There was an obituary in the paper this morning, Jamie Mock Robbins, early sanctuary leader. The Reverend Jamie Mock Robbins was an early leader in the sanctuary movement to aid Central American refugees. He died Thursday at the ripe old age of 32. Mock Robbins was the co-pastor of the University Baptist Church. He's been battling cancer since October. That's a 5-month cancer, the quickest that we have of these people with knowledgeable information or making social change is Jack Ruby, who had a 3-week cancer, but this is a 5-month cancer, and he is dead at age 32. In 1982, under the direction of Mock Robbins and Reverend Cook, University Baptist became the first church in the Pacific Northwest to declare itself a sanctuary for refugees fleeing persecution in Central America. 50 refugees have been sheltered in the church. Mark Robbins spent much of his 4 years in Central America working with schools and churches and helped organize relief in 1986 for victims of San Salvador earthquake that left 1,000 people dead. Another quick cancer case that is pertinent. Last November 20th, on Friday, 1987, there was an article regarding Michael Aquino and the Satanic Church, and it's from the San Francisco Chronicle, saying that Aquino was suing the San Francisco Police Department for an illegal search and seizure of property from his home on Leavenworth in San Francisco, and for illegal retention of property in violation of his constitutional rights. And he claimed that his claim was dated November 12th, that the city of San Francisco and the police department had gone into his home, and he named police officers Glenn Pamfloff and Sandra Gallant. The article goes into the complaint he has, but there's a paragraph of interest here for the moment. Aquino's home at 2430 Leavenworth Street was raided August 14th by police and FBI agents and officers from the Army's Criminal Investigation Division, armed with a search warrant authorizing them to look for evidence of child molestation. Then a listener to World Watchers who sent me this article that I had earlier but would probably not have remembered in conjunction with the demise in the Bay Area in a small city, San Leandro, near San Francisco, has an obituary about Richard L. LaForce. Richard LaForce, 65, died of cancer at home Friday. A native of Colorado, he only recently retired from a 40-year career as a warrant officer in the Army's Criminal Investigation Division, working out of the Presidio in San Francisco. He got cancer just 3 months earlier. He was working November the 20th. The Presidio Investigation Committee was going into the home of Michael Aquino, and that was published November the 20th. March the 1st, there's the death of a gentleman who worked with the Presidio in San Francisco, and there had been complaints from 1982 on about Michael Aquino and children that were taken to the hospital associated with the military base at the Presidio Letterman Hospital. So Michael Aquino, as I mentioned on a broadcast several weeks ago, was under observation by some people since 1982, and one of the criminal investigators, just as this trial is being totally closed down, and he was really never named as a defendant, even with strong evidence and recognition by children that they had been taken to his home. One of the criminal investigators from the Presidio is dead of cancer. I mentioned last week the homicide of a woman in the San Francisco area, Gretchen Burford Durnitz, 49 years old, who went to the Versatel window at the bank and sitting in her car was a gentleman with a butcher knife who slashed her up and killed her when she went back to her car, the Versatel at Wells Fargo Bank. The San Francisco Chronicle had one sentence in their article. It was different than the Examiner, the Daily Examiner. It said that Durnitz worked as an attorney in private practice, specializing in family, child abuse, and criminal law. I mentioned her before, but the word child abuse, for you researchers who want the date, came from San Francisco Chronicle, February 29th, and she was interested in that particular subject. Another obituary, March the 1st, Presidio woman brutally slain. The wife of an Army sergeant was found brutally beaten in her home. She was shot and stabbed to death in their residence on the military base where all of this activity is churning and happening. Cheryl Stevens, 27, was found in a pool of blood when her husband returned home with the small children. Neighbors said that they didn't hear anything, and the article says you might have expected that they would. There's hundreds of neighbors who could have been expected to hear or have seen the commotion. The FBI has no leads in the case. 3 bullets tore her upper body. A bullet grazed her head. She had numerous stab wounds and bruises on the neck, arms, and hands. They found a large kitchen knife near her left hand, a smaller knife. She had put up a strong fight. This is the 3rd slaying on the Presidio in 10 years. I have mentioned on the World Watchers that as soon as Reagan is out of office, there are going to be a lot of books about his administration. 2 of them were just in the newspaper this week. And as I said before, we have to start saving our money because there will be so many books that will be pouring out about the Reagan administration. And, of course, President George Bush and CIA Director William Webster will distance themselves from the fact that they participated in these very activities with the current President of the United States. The first book described is called Secret Warriors Inside the Covert Military Operations of the Reagan Era by Stephen Emerson. And this goes into various CIA plans, how Reagan set up highly secret units in the early 1980s. That's as soon as the Pentagon set them up as soon as Reagan was elected by November, or even prior, just prior to that, they knew that he would be the next president of the United States. And had set up these secret units in the early 80s, and he was inaugurated in January 81. And some of these units were never disclosed either to Congress or some senior military officials or intelligence agencies. They were outside the agencies. And this article refers to the group called Yellow Fruit that I've talked about, but never had enough time to really develop and go into it. There are sections, chapters on the Covert Army unit, codenamed Yellow Fruit, and that was a unit that I had said before was meant to be disbanded after the October 80 surprise that failed in Iran, that allowed the hostages to not be rescued and made Reagan President Bush vice president. Incidentally, if my voice is tired, that comes from so many nice people calling for the last week on the telephone, and I'm sure you hear the difference. I've been talking too much on the phone. Between now and next week, when I make a tape for you, I hope to rest my voice. It's just been a lot of very attentive people and newspaper people, TV, radio, a lot of media coverage on what's happening here. So bear with me with the tired voice, and we'll hope to rest it by next week if things let up a little bit. This book, The Secret Warriors, the Inside of the Covert Military Operations of the Reagan Era, is important because, as I said, these policies are made every 20 years, and even before he was inaugurated, even by a fluke, if Mondale had won, the same policies would be in hand, and the same secret team and the Willard Zukers and the Ollie Norths and so forth would still be doing their operations, because these people control all our policies and don't include the CIA, the Defense Department, or anybody else, members of Congress, in what they are doing. It just happened this time. They were caught. So there's a list of materials in the San Francisco Chronicle account. It was in the New York Times today, too. That are in the book, and one interesting one is a classified CIA document drafted in 1984 that said the CIA had reason to believe that a company headed by one of their key intermediaries, and that turns out to be Albert Hakim, may be associated with Iran terrorist-supported activities being run out of the Iranian installations in Vienna and Barcelona. And I had on the air a while back, and so did David Emery, material from a newspaper that we got in San Jose that Albert Hakim was in touch with our ambassador, Helena von Dahm. And of course, I've linked her for years to Otto von Bolschwing and the Reinhard Gehlen operation. So we'll see more about Hakim and Vienna in this book, Secret Warriors by Stephen Emerson, a very important book on how the operations go no matter who is president. Another book on a subject that I've only done a few broadcasts on. In fact, I was speaking about this subject on the broadcast on KPFK when I got the call, "You'll never be heard on the air again." This book is called Low Intensity Warfare, Counterinsurgency and Pro-Insurgency and Anti-Terrorism in the 80s. A long title and a very important book, Low Intensity Warfare, Counterinsurgency, Pro-Insurgency, Anti-Terrorism in the 80s, edited by Michael Clare, Klare, and Peter Kornbluh, Kornbluh, Pantheon Books. This is $8.95 in a paperbound. It was reviewed in the newspaper in these times. And this goes into the forming of the Special Forces in 1962, the year before Kennedy was killed, so that the article implies that high tech at the fringes meets John Kennedy's new frontier. But the fact that the Special Forces was formed 1 year before Kennedy was killed and the plans to murder him were set up in 1960 with Robert Mayhew and the intelligence and mafia coordinated branches, then the heritage of Kennedy could be aligned to this terrorism and the murders and the deaths, even though he only lived 1,000 days and may not have had the faintest idea what the Special Forces would be doing after he's dead. And this book goes into how Ronald Reagan, who had the Red Menace in front of him all along, when he became president, the reviewer of the book says he saw the bear's paw wherever third world nations thumb their nose at Uncle Sam. And this tells about their divisions of high intensity is World War III, and also high intensity, the plans are on the drawing board for World War IV. Medium intensity, Iran-Iraq war. Low intensity is just about anything else. A protracted Contra war is stationing Marines in Lebanon, and it's low intensity conflict that we're feeling in the United States, I feel, at this time. Now, this book on low-intensity warfare, counterinsurgency, goes into the Pentagon spending, they describe them as Rambo-esque Special Operations Forces, which is the Delta Force, the SEALs team. And that Delta Force SEALs team is the part that Michael Aquino from the Pentagon is partaking in, as a lieutenant colonel, and Ollie North. And the book goes into the Rapid Deployment Forces, the Light Infantry Divisions, and their attendant hardware that has sextupled since 1981. Not only has Ronald Reagan appointed over 275 judges, but he has increased the budget 6 times over, which is described as the fastest growing component of the war budget. Its current annual budget is $2.5 billion, and it's put in the hands of individuals who melt into your community but who are trained to take over hamlets and towns, that these are the people that will take over America and be turned against America. That is what is happening now. This book says that this figure doesn't even include the billions spent each year on CIA covert operations, which have tripled under Ronald Reagan, and much of the combat in low-intensity warfare is non-military, with billions more going into psychological operations. Of course, Michael Aquino of the Church of Set is an expert in psychological operations, and they go into foreign aid to win the hearts and minds of the population they're going to target. El Salvador alone has cost $2 billion since 1980, 3/4 of it related to the war. So this is a very important book. Michael T. Clare and Mr. Kornbluh, Pantheon Books, $8.95. Those are 2 excellent subjects, and I predicted that this era would see soon all of these books. The question is, how fast can you operate to stop this when the Pentagon is swinging their muscle into these kinds of low-intensity conflicts where they take over the newspapers, combine the radio stations, and also use agents to call and say you never can be heard on the radio again. So the radio isn't free, and I didn't doubt for a minute that the call I got came from this kind of a specific operation, particularly since when another person got a telephone call and reached me saying I'm a fascist, I'm proud of it, and another one being told his head would be cut off and we're going to shit down your neck. The feces and the mutilation are part of the occult. The occult is part of the military, and the military is part of the Nazi rituals. Wall Street Journal had a story this morning. Many of you saw it on all the papers about Robert McFarlane is going to plead guilty, but don't sit on the edge of your chair and think that he's another John Dean who's going to tell you what is happening. Arthur Lyman, the special prosecutor for the House Intelligence Committee, made it very loud and clear on NBC News this morning that McFarlane will not implicate George Bush. So no matter what he says, it will not bring in George Bush. Lyndon LaRouche is having an interesting twist in his trial. I haven't done anything on that. There have been articles covering it. Mr. Frankenhauser, a man who worked with the Nazi Party and the FBI, was infiltrating and working with LaRouche. LaRouche deserved the pain in the neck he got from Frankenhauser if he trusted a man who worked with the Klan and the Nazi Party. But now even LaRouche's own attorney is taking another look at their case, and this story just came out today. In Boston, it says 2 months into the trial of Lyndon LaRouche comes evidence supporting the political extremist claim that he is the target of plots by the FBI, the CIA, and even Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North. His own defense lawyer, who dismissed LaRouche originally for some of his conspiracy theories and thought they were bizarre, is changing his opinion. The trial of LaRouche involves 6 aides and 5 political organizations about fraud and conspiracy and taking money from people who donated to him. And the defense lawyers are saying, we want the files on the White House and Vice President George Bush. That's the man named George Bush, is named twice in the articles regarding the new turn in these events, and evidence suggesting infiltration of the LaRouche group. The prosecutors insisted that talk of FBI, CIA, and other government infiltration getting declassified documents is irrelevant. They never say the NSC or the National Security Agency, the NSA. It's always the FBI and CIA, and Iran-Contra was about the NSC and the NSA. But the newspaper reported today that right now the tables are turned on the government, and they've been ordered to search their papers to find material on the FBI, the CIA, and the National Security Council, and George Bush. It would be nice if Lyndon LaRouche, the man that everybody kicks on, talks about, and hates, they love to hate him, and I give credit for a lot of the information I got. I never would have gotten it without his publications. He's hitting the matter of George Bush. It seems that his lawyer last week got a memo that is a copy, well, it is the memo from retired Air Force Major General Richard Secord to Oliver North, in which Secord says that a retired Army Sergeant Major Fred Lewis met with the FBI and other agencies, and they began to collect information against LaRouche. The defense demanded the FBI files that mention anything about Army Sergeant Major Fred Lewis be made available to them, because there's a document which shows that Lewis and 2 Texas lawmen worked as government informants, and the CIA and FBI asked them to infiltrate LaRouche. Lewis and the lawmen, this is the military and the Texas lawmen, were involved in 2 Texas companies used by the Pentagon and the CIA for covert activities. One might have been Peregrine, and I mentioned on the air several Texas companies that were covers. One probably surely is Peregrine, but there are 2 Texas companies that were used by the Pentagon for CIA. And then the report on this LaRouche case now says that the mere existence of documents of Richard Secord, General Secord, and Oliver North, one a, in quotes, retired general, and the other from the National Security Council, sets this case at a different pace. And even his own defense attorney begins to see now, a man named Michael Riley, that this is going in a different direction, that he didn't believe LaRouche. He said, "This is a fundamental change in my defense strategy. I should have had this 18 months ago. I have a right to have it before I pursue the case." Another defense attorney, William Moffat, said his legal strategy will be affected by documents involving Oliver North and General Secord and two Texas companies used by the Pentagon, used by the CIA to discredit Lyndon LaRouche. So I'll do more and update the LaRouche case soon, but that's an important new twist. Now, Carl Rowan, the black syndicated columnist, has a story this week that may not be in your newspaper, so I'm almost, I think I'll read the whole thing to you. I usually outline and paraphrase, but this is very important. Carl Rowan worked for U.S. Information Agency, which is a branch of the CIA, the intelligence community. He was selected as the token spokesman to present the Warren Report to the world the day it was published as being the definitive story of how a loner, Lee Harvey Oswald, shot John Kennedy. Now, Carl Rowan never, I don't think, in his wildest dreams, realized how a black intelligence agent of the establishment who worked his way into there, he never could visualize that not only after John Kennedy was murdered and the Warren Commission report came out in 1964, then Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King were killed in 1968, and that fascists and Nazis, outright fascists and Nazis, and not neo-Nazis, but German Nazis, along with American Nazis, but particularly German, were involved in the murder of a network of organizations of Reverend Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, and John Kennedy. So he danced to their tune going back to 1964, and I have copies of the documents of his press conference. But now Carl Rowan sees something different since he took that role in 1964, and he's recognizing one of the big sources of problems in the world 24 years later, namely Henry Kissinger. And Kissinger and his mentor Fritz Kramer are important to the George Bush story that I'll go into in a few minutes. But Carl Rowan is commenting about the memos that have been revealed of Henry Kissinger that were in the newspaper last week, suggesting how the Israeli government should handle their trouble in the Gaza Strip. What Henry Kissinger wrote is that Israel should stop the news media from entry into the territories involved in the present demonstrations. Don't let any news people there, and accept the short-term world criticism, because that's all it ever is short-term. People have a memory of about 7 hours to 2 days. And he suggested take the short-term world criticism, as Israel had to take by going into Lebanon in 1982 and killing hundreds of women and children. He said, take the short term and accept your criticism from the world press, for what you're doing. But he suggested don't allow the press in. And what you should do is put down the insurrection as quickly as possible, overwhelmingly, brutally, and rapid. Brutally is what he worked out with Pinochet in Chile, with Mr. Zia in Pakistan, in Iran with the Shah, when the Shah came in and Mossadegh was out, with Mr. Diem in Vietnam, with Klaus Barbie in Bolivia, and Joseph Mengele and the top Nazis in Brazil. That do it brutally and rapidly and don't tell the press. That's Henry Kissinger caught with a memo. Now, Carl Rowan said of all the qualities of former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, perhaps the most remarkable are these: his shrewdness in using official secrecy, informal off-the-record rules to hide his personal views and actions that have led to significant and enduring foreign policy blunders. And when you think of the foreign policy blunders, remember that Henry Kissinger has been behind every single one of them in South Africa, Middle East, India, Southeast Asia, and in the United States. Rowan says his use of indignation, of feigned or real, to keep the public from viewing him as a villain, when he was wiretapping journalists, when he was bombing Cambodia, when he was responsible for the deterioration of Americans' position in Latin America, the encouragement of apartheid regime in South Africa. He created a dangerous Middle East mess that has left Secretary of State George Shultz on the knee supplicant to Israel Prime Minister Shamir even though Shamir and his policies would never survive without U.S. economic support. Now Kissinger has been caught again moving in the shadows of secrecy, saying privately what he dares not say publicly. He is portrayed as stealthily influencing countries like South Africa and Israel to do outrageous, immoral, eventually self-destroying things. Can you imagine Henry Kissinger saying publicly that the way to halt insurrection in Palestine with boys, women, men in the Israeli-occupied West Bank and Gaza Strip is to strike, as quickly as possible? Isn't this vintage Kissinger, he asks, and isn't this outrageous, suggesting these tactics and be overwhelmingly brutal, be fast, don't let the press see this? Can you imagine him saying that publicly? And Henry Kissinger has been getting the press on Nightline and CBS and NBC, always the elder statesman balancing this power struggle in Washington, making himself and his cronies from Kissinger Associates, Mr. Eagleberger, and his crony Alexander Haig look like great statesmen. Carl Rowan says, this is vintage Kissinger, the secret advisor. But that is what Kissinger said to about 8 members of the Conference of Presidents of major American Jewish organizations at a breakfast meeting in February. Would you expect Kissinger to state publicly that to stop violence in the occupied areas, the first step should be to throw out the television like they did in South Africa? No, but Mr. Berman's memo says that Kissinger said it privately. Kissinger told Israel to adopt the tactics of the hated Botha regime that decided it was better to beat and kill people when they were out of view of newsmen and cameras. The trouble is that Kissinger's private views and urging on behalf of Israel are now made public. The New York Times got a copy of Berman's summary of what Kissinger said. Goodness knows what else was in there. As has so often been the case, Kissinger's reaction was to blame the news media for finding out what he was doing it and saying it in the shadows. Remember the White House plumbers that were there because stories were leaking about, this Kissinger, the Fuhrer in the White House, running the National Security Council for President Nixon. Once Kennedy's head was blown off, one in Dallas and one in Los Angeles, Nixon finally got the White House throne with Kissinger at his right hand advising him. And when things were wrong and people caught on that America not only had these assassinations, but that America was changing, it was Kissinger who was advising in the shadows. Rowan says, well, it's sort of disgusting to millions of us Americans to learn that Kissinger privately admires police and military brutality and press restrictions. Rowan's a slower learner, I might add. He said that he approves of the various barbarous repressions of South Africa that deny a black majority political, economic, and social justice, and Kissinger is secretly urging Israel behave like South Africa. Mr. Berman's 4-page memo, dated February the 3rd, indicated that Kissinger was privately, and this goes on again to the role of Kissinger, undermining George Shultz's efforts in the mission of peace in the Middle East to get Shamir and the hardline Israelis to agree to the end of occupation in certain areas, accept the concept of land for peace. The memo quotes Kissinger as saying that the peace conference may lead to a disaster. Now, I have articles on Henry Kissinger's investment and interest in turning the Gaza Strip into a Monte Carlo mafia type of gambling organization, along with some prominent Israelis and people in America. And he doesn't want his real estate given up that Israel has secured for him. Heavens, no. And he is saying, trying to sabotage the peace conference of Shamir and the other persons trying to work out a solution. Carl Rowan said, why doesn't Kissinger clear the air by telling us whether he really likes the Botha regime in South Africa, whether he urged Israel to move brutally and rapidly, which is what was in the memos, and to squelch the Palestinians, and whether he prefers to shoot Palestinian insurgents rather than break their bones. At first it was convenient to break their bones, but tell us, Henry, is it better to shoot them? And what are you doing writing these kinds of memos? He asked. He said, it's time we heard from the real Henry Kissinger. Well, I suggest it's time we heard from the real Fritz Kramer, a la Henry Kissinger. And that is the real Kissinger who's been there for everyone to see what he's done to India, Portugal, Brazil, all these various countries, Kissinger and his cohorts, and Kissinger and Kramer. So finally, Karl Rowan is getting a whiff of the real Kissinger. I'll turn over this tape now and continue part 2 of George Bush and the Odessa Network and what we have to look forward to when George Bush is made President of the United States. This is Mae Brussell. This is the second half of broadcast number 849, March the 14th, 1988. I'm going to do a series of broadcasts continuously, which I've done on fascism in America, and sometimes I'm going to repeat or go over material which I don't like to do for long subscribers, but there are so many new listeners that have caught on to the broadcast of World Watchers and been deprived of a lot of the information of the past, and what I'm having on the air now, so much of it relates to the past that occasionally I am going to go back for you on some very important information. One of them is the FBI report that was written for me in 1967. That was a long time ago, 21 years ago, and I referred to it briefly last week on the air, but I want to remind the people who take this tape that the FBI started a report on Mae Brussell 21 years ago because she stated publicly that she was afraid of fascism, and the FBI decided that the matter had to be handled immediately, and replies marked for the attention of the General Investigative Division because I became a threat. It's interesting that in the course of writing up this FBI report, and each time I read it, I even see different things here. It said that the FBI agency in San Francisco determined that Mrs. Brussell in the past has expressed great alarm over the fact that the United States is becoming fascist. So the report was written in 1967, and I was worried about fascism even before they decided to write the report, and I was concerned about conspirators in this country. And the great word that they keep using 3 times in the report, she even expressed it publicly, and therefore I became an enemy of the state, and fascism is what I have been afraid of, and I mention this report often because it should sink into people's heads exactly what the FBI and Secret Service have in mind when people speak up, and that the real danger is not fascism, and you have to get that loud and clear. The real danger for them is a person who exposes fascism until they can come out in the open, as did Hitler in 1933. Now, I briefly mentioned last week, and I want to do more on this now, an article from the San Francisco Examiner, February 29, 1988, former CIA agent running a covert campaign for George Bush. Former CIA agent who's highly critical of the Reagan administration and their covert operations, Miles Copeland, is assisting Vice President George Bush and wants to renovate the spy agency. The covert operations practitioner who served in the 1950s in the CIA as a link to Gamal Abdel Nasser, and that's the point I want to emphasize tonight, and I briefly mentioned last week. Miles Copeland was a link to Gamal Abdel Nasser, the anti-Israeli Egyptian nationalist leader. In fact, in the book, Kukerich's book, Galen's Spy of the Century, it mentions Mr. Copeland. Mr. Copeland said that he and other people who are retired from the CIA support George Bush. He was their CIA director in 1976-77. Copeland is working with other retired intelligence operators, also from the DIA, in a way that covert operations should be run. They're working on it now and will present to George Bush evidence the way they think they should run covert operations and take over entire countries. He said the fault of the Reagan administration has not been in keeping secrets, but doing stupid things in secret. He acknowledged that he wants George Bush to work closer with Arab nations and push aside a lot of the interest in Israel for the Arab nations. He said this would cause problems for the Bush campaign, but he believes it's time to do this. And as I mentioned last week, Bush is always wary of Israel's role in the secret weapons sales before. The former CIA officer was working behind the scenes to promote Bush, along with Archibald Roosevelt. Kermit Roosevelt was the one who worked with the overthrow of Iran, of Mossadegh, and put in the Shah. Archibald Roosevelt, and I'm not sure whether he means, the author says Archibald, but I think it was Kermit Roosevelt who worked with Copeland. And they worked together in the Middle East in the 1950s. The source said that Roosevelt had discussed Copeland's ideas for a new CIA with George Bush. Mr. Roosevelt had. Copeland said that he will be meeting with Bush in the near future, and he will brief him. And Copeland's confidential paper last summer, where he made up a plan and reported his intention to write material for Bush. He wouldn't give campaign speeches, but he would write an outline of the intelligence community and how the covert operations should work and how CIA people should topple governments and promote U.S. interests, forget guerrilla warfare. And Copeland said he had been approached by manager Ghorbanifar, the Iranian middleman, for help in promoting the sales with Casey. Copeland was in the OSS. He went in the CIA right in the late 40s. As soon as it became the CIA, 1947 is when it became the CIA. He was a consultant on operational techniques. This man that worked in Egypt for the CIA is the link to Nasser and Kermit Roosevelt. Now, in the book Galen, Spy of the Century, it tells, and I've had this on the air a long time ago, but again, there's new listeners. I had it in 1979 about Miles Copeland, and maybe updated it since then, but that was 9 years ago when I referred to this book, How the British Government Got Out of Egypt. And by 1951, Allen Dulles had sent Kermit Roosevelt. I've never heard the other name is, I think the author of that article, the Examiner, has it wrong. It's Kermit Kim Roosevelt, the grandson of President Teddy Roosevelt, the Rough Rider, went to Egypt, and they began their assignment. They got rid of King Farouk and put in Mr. Nasser, and the intelligence community took over from what Great Britain had in Egypt, and the CIA and Reinhard Gehlen then became in charge of the Egyptian operation. Incidentally, on Good Morning America, about 2 weeks ago when they had the primaries in South Dakota, members of the Indian reservation were saying why they didn't appreciate the statue of Teddy Roosevelt at Mount Rushmore. And they criticized the other presidents there, but the Indian speaking, and I taped this off and have it on the video, he said that they didn't like Teddy Roosevelt because he's the person who said, this is the quote, "If America is to realize its manifest destination, the tribal populations must be crushed. Our manifest destination was decided by Teddy Roosevelt, or spoken about by Teddy Roosevelt, and the Indians were aware of it. It's pre-Hitler days, and Teddy Roosevelt's grandson then went in with the CIA. Galen, Spy of the Century, said the American government put $40 million into Egypt's economy, and Allen Dulles sent Mr. Nasser a personal gift from President Eisenhower of $3 million, which Kim Roosevelt's friend Miles Copeland gave to Nasser's secretary in suitcases. And Miles Copeland then worked in Egypt, where Nasser needed people to organize his secret service, so he directed his espionage and training saboteurs against Israel and advised on the surveillance of his enemies inside Egypt. The Muslim Brotherhood and the Americans turned to Reinhard Gehlen, Hitler's chief of intelligence, and he suggested his old friend, ex-SS Sturmfuhrer Otto Skorzeny, on the assignment of Egypt. So as soon as Skorzeny was released from Europe as a war criminal, he was in jail and walked away, held in American captivity and released. He was held 3 years, released in 1948, the same date as Fritz Kramer, Henry Kissinger's mentor. He went to Spain and set up an engineering business, and he promoted the CIA in Madrid and began appearing in Egypt, working with Nasser. And Allen Dulles, the man who was in the OSS, who was working with Karl Wolff, and Himmler's liaison, working out of Bern, Switzerland, Allen Dulles and Reinhard Gehlen, Hitler's chief of intelligence, approached Skorzeny's father-in-law, Dr. Hallmar Schacht, who was once Hitler's financial wizard, who was acquitted at Nuremberg and got out of his 8-year sentence under the denazification laws. Skorzeny went to Egypt for about a year. Then he left Nasser's Secret Service in the good hands. It was in the hands of other Waffen-SS and Gestapo men. He recruited 50, some of whom were summoned from Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Spain, where they found a safe haven from Allied prosecution as war criminals. Among his assistants was a high official of Goebbels' propaganda minister and Himmler's RSHA, Franz Bunch, an expert on Jewish matters. He had worked with Adolf Eichmann on the final solution during the war. He wrote a book called The Sexual Habits of the Jews. It was probably the most viciously pornographic document ever produced by the Nazis. This is Galen, Spy of the Century by Cookridge. These German intelligence in Cairo looked to Reinhard Galen for advice. He appointed a liaison officer to them who he sent from Germany. He was a bird of the same feather, an ex-SS officer and deputy Reich leader of the Hitler Youth, Mr. Hermann Lauder, and he went over there to Egypt to assist the head of the Hitler Youth. And, of course, then in Egypt he could recruit the Nazis from the Hitler Youth to his side. They were young and ready to fight, so he could take the ones that he had already decided were important and get them over to Egypt. A little background on this book that mentions Miles Copeland and Otto Skorzeny from Galen, Spy of the Century. And this chapter also goes into their role against Israel, the Egyptians, and Mr. Brunner, who was set up in Syria, one of the top Nazis who loathed Jews, who's alive today, and protected in the government of Syria. And I'll do more about him later. Now, the subject that I've researched for many years is the problem. The people behind Henry Kissinger, his mentor Fritz Kramer, and also the relationship of Fritz Kramer to Otto Skorzeny, who set up this operation in Egypt. And so I go to another book that I've quoted and used before, but it's pertinent now, as these people are going to run the George Bush campaign, and Bush is directly tied to Mr. Townley, Michael Townley, and Colonial Dignidad, to the Defense Department, the Mertz Corporation, the weapons that were worked out with Klaus Barbie, and the network of Colonial Dignidad I've had on the air and want to continue some more. But George Bush and the Ronald Reagan administration have worked, used a weapon supplier for Ollie North and the secret team. And again, the secret team, the Stanford Technology Training Group, came from Hakim buying International Imaging, which belonged to Otto von Bolschwing, a man who was part of the final solution of the Jews, but who worked and became the Galen representative when Galen left this country after the war back to Germany to set up his network with the head of the Hitler Youth. And these people, Miles Copeland and his association with Skorzeny, is tied directly to the network in California to Ronald Reagan and to George Bush, who will be the next president. In the book The Damned Engineers, published, it came out in 1970, written by Janice Giles, Giles, Houghton Mifflin, there is a section on Otto Skorzeny and Fritz Kramer, the two that merged together. Now, Skorzeny got out of the American jail, and by 1949 he was on his way to setting up the Nazi network, and by 1948 we have that plans officer, the mentor of Kissinger in the Pentagon, who I believe is the same Waffen-SS Fritz Kramer that worked with Skorzeny. They all appear together today, and they were together before, and I have no way of ever believing these are separate people, those two Kramers. In the book, The Damned Engineers, Giles says the 6th Panzer Division in the Battle of the Bulge, they're talking about, this is the end of the war where the Nazis were to be routed up by the Americans and protected till they could do what they're doing today, and doing it very well. The Panzer Division was politically colored. All its armored divisions happened to be from the Waffen-SS. Hitler did this purposely and intentionally gave it the most important role to play. He was still sore and angry with attempts on his life and the evidence of treason inside the Wehrmacht, and he wanted the plans and operations that he made to be under Waffen-SS Fritz Kramer, under the operations of the 6th Panzer Division. This evidence is in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. Planned in 1944 to 45, the Nazis went underground in 1943, and these plans were made. The army was made up largely of dedicated Nazis, sworn to obedience, who could be counted on to make a hard try for Antwerp and stay together. Hitler had to have the big solution. He had to have a new war, and what he was really doing is sending them up again to be rounded up by General Patton, George Patton, and the sympathetic persons that would protect them. He gave his most important role to his loyal, obedient SS officers. On paper, this army was not referred to as the 6th SS Panzer Army, but Hitler occasionally slipped and called it that, as we have seen by Colonel von der Heydt's written orders. Hitler gave the command of this army to his old and valued Nazi friend Sepp Dietrich, a person he had known for a long time, since World War I. He was a faithful follower of the Führer's. He would convert people to the Hitler causes. He was converted, and they faithfully followed him, and Hitler rewarded his loyal old comrade with the command of the important post in the army, and along with him, with his friend Sepp Dietrich, he put a brilliant Wehrmacht strategist, Chief of Staff General Fritz Kramer. This Fritz Kramer, Kissinger's mentor, is a strategist in the Pentagon, a chief strategist. Translated, they're not in any of the battles or roll up their sleeves, but they do the planning. Although the goal was Antwerp and understood to achieve it, Kramer had an excellent encirclement of Liège, and I won't go into the tactical part of the Battle of the Bulge. I've done it on many broadcasts, and they're available if you want them. Now, in this same book, The Damned Engineers, it tells about how Mr. General von Rundstedt and Model rounded up their favorites, and included among them was a man who was brought by order of Hitler's headquarters. He was Lieutenant Colonel Otto Skorzeny, considered by Allied intelligence to be the supreme commander of the German forces and their most dangerous agent. Otto Skorzeny was brought in by Reinhard Gehlen, who brought in Miles Copeland, and they're the men that worked in Egypt. Egypt is now building the United States Abrams tanks, and of course they will be headed towards Israel before too long. Otto Skorzeny was Austrian, just as was Hitler. He came from a long line of soldiers who served the Habsburgs, and Hitler told Skorzeny that he was going to give him the most important job of his life. All details of the plans and operations of Skorzeny's work are in a book called The Ardennes Offensive. There's a lot about Skorzeny, and Skorzeny also wrote a book, autobiographical, Skorzeny's Special Mission, published in 1957. That was a few years after he went to Egypt and worked with the CIA. Hitler was to give him the most important job of his life. He wanted him to raise an armored brigade in the image of the Americans. Hitler said, wear American uniforms, which he obtained. He obtained American uniforms, drive American vehicles, which he obtained, speak their language, and he trained his whole group to speak English and to tap a cigarette the way Americans would do it and eat American food. And such troops are going to mingle with the Americans, which they did, and take part in routing and retreating when the offensive began, and hold on to the bridgehead. And Skorzeny was very good at English. The plan was given the name Operation Greif, G-R-E-I-F in German. I think in English you might call it I-E-F. The Americans, at least 750 alive, taken as prisoners, were gunned down on orders of Fritz Kramer to kill all of them. And I think that's so people wouldn't recognize him when he showed up in the Pentagon a few years later. So Operation Greif, the German name, doesn't mean sadness like the American IEF, but worse, it's after a mythical bird like a condor, Operation Greif. Now the condor, or the bird, can rise again like the phoenix, the condor. And I'm going into George Bush and the condor, and for as many weeks, maybe for a year, or 3 months, or 6 months, the Nazi fascist links of George Bush and Fritz Kramer, Skorzeny, and Miles Copeland, the people that are going to take over the CIA and advising the president. They were not talking about back World War II. We're talking about a lineage that goes continuously to the present. And to help you, I will do charts maybe this week and next week, and continuously then add pieces to those charts so you can visualize what I'm talking about. English-speaking volunteers were requested. They arrived at Skorzeny's headquarters. His special service troops had been the envy of young men in all branches of the German armed services. Starting in 1943, they were organized. That's the exact year that the Nazis went underground, when Allen Dulles moved to Bern, Switzerland. Reinhard Gehlen, Hitler's intelligence agent, was putting away papers for the Americans to use because it was obvious that they were not going to be able to conquer Russia. After their battle, they were retreating. And the Nazis took the papers of Reinhard Gehlen to use when the war was over. And this book, The Damned Engineer, said there was no lack of volunteers. They quickly learned all that he had to teach them, the basic requirements, the ability to speak English. He went to the high command and convinced them that he had full English-speaking troops. He never could create a full brigade, but he had a lot of them, and he had demanded 2 tank battalions, a paratroop battalion, signalmen, and so forth. And Otto Skorzeny presented this to Hitler. Hitler was very pleased about Skorzeny's work, and Hitler incorporated him into the Fritz Kramer operation with Sepp Dietrich. And then Skorzeny continued after all of this and went into U.S. military intelligence. All he needed was, he said, according to this book, 30 people in the German units with American persons, and Watch on the Rhine, in quotes, moved forward with Hitler advising Fritz Kramer and Otto Skorzeny. So if this Adolf did live in Mendoza, Argentina, and was down there, as I believe he was, and I can review some more of that for you, I just bring up the sections from this particular book, The Damned Engineers. It's the closeness of Adolf Hitler with Skorzeny and Fritz Kramer, and is dependent upon them. And also in the book, Gehlen's Spy of the Century, how the BND, the German intelligence, was interested in the Middle East. And Gehlen established several homes besides Pulak, which is where he stayed in Germany. He had foreign branches equivalent to CIA stations in Arab capitals, and he was involved in 1958 with some of Nasser's enemies even. And this book, Gehlen's Spy of the Century, goes into the Nazis and top Nazis that were used throughout Europe and placed in key positions in Cairo. To the Cairo residency of the German intelligence, Gehlen sent one of his senior officers, 35-year-old Gerard Bauch, the stepson of Reinhard Gehlen's vice president, Major General Hans Heinrich Wargitsky. Bauch lived in Cairo under the cover of being a representative of the Quant Corporation, a German heavy industry concern. In Damascus, Syria, the Reinhard Gehlen's head, was run by ex-Sturmfuhrer Alois Brunner, a Nazi that should have been brought in a long time ago, but works with the German intelligence. And remember that Otto von Bolschwing took over the Gehlen operation in this country, traveling all over the world. And Brunner joined Mr. Bunch in Cairo. They were old friends. They worked under Adolf Eichmann with the Jewish department taking care of the Jews. So Gehlen's Spy of the Century names Miles Copeland and his relationship to these people. And the Damned Engineers tells the relationship of Skorzeny, who brought Copeland into this, and working with Fritz Kramer. And I believe that's the same Kramer who gave us Vietnam, or all these various coups that have taken place since World War II, and have promoted the likes of Henry Kissinger. Now, I'm reading books that came out a few years ago, and very early, in 1980, that's 8 years ago, Lyndon LaRouche's newspaper, New Solidarity, had an article on the Nazi SS, the SS agents, SS stormtroopers being hired by the CIA, setting up a Nazi network. The title of the article is The SS, the Use of the SS for the CIA Nazi Network, run by the Colonel Otto Skorzeny. There's a picture of Skorzeny that looks very much like Robert Bork, believe it or not. And this was written in 1980, and that was 8 years ago. And while people badmouth and put down LaRouche, I challenge persons to come out with as much information as there has been in this one article, and he was continuously alerting people to these matters. And I'm going back to an article I've had for a long time. April 11th, 1980 is when the Bologna bombing took place at the train station there. There were about 85 people killed and 250 injured. And right now, sitting in the Italian jail as part of a team of about 11 or 12 people who did that bombing and tried to blame the leftists and the communists, or even just call it the strategy of tension, which we're going to feel in this country that'll soon break out if it's consistent with what these people have done before. In the Italian jail are two very prominent Italians, Francesco Pazienza and Licio Gelli. Pazienza, a close associate with Michael Ledeen, with the Italian intelligence system, and Gelli, the head of the P2, the plans to turn Europe and the world into Nazi tactics. Again, Gelli worked for Adolf Hitler's SS, for Mussolini's intelligence, then went to Argentina and teamed up with Juan Perón. He early worked with Franco in Spain. So those two men are in jail at the present time to show that sometimes these big bosses do get rounded up, but first you have to kill 85 people. They've killed a lot more than that. And, of course, Licio Gelli helped build the rat line that took Klaus Barbie down and out of Italy with help of the Vatican to Bolivia, and Henry Kissinger was in charge of part of the CIC and Klaus Barbie before he could go down to Bolivia. So this was the terrorism that took place in Italy, and 1 week later, an article in New Solidarity at great length goes into Scorzeni's responsibility and network to the Bologna bombing. And this is the way the article reads, and it goes into Scorzeni's 1950 activities when he was working with Miles Copeland. There have been an unabated wave of fascist bombings and assassinations, plot after plot, aiming for a fascist coup d'etat in Italy. Fascist terror attacks run, and along with Minister of Defense, Mr. Giulio Andreotti. As part of NATO, they're working with the CIA and NATO, giving the orders, and they hope to drive the left, the would-be left or communists, into the protective arms of Andreotti. We're told that George Bush is a moderate, a mealy-mouthed, and a lot of terrorism would drive you to him instead of an extremist like Jack Kemp or Pat Robertson. Fascist terror attacks, the article says, are happening, as I say, by the intelligence community, and it is fairly common knowledge throughout all of Europe that the extreme right-wing terrorist group are completely integrated with each other and are not separate. The European press, especially the Italian press, run regular exposés of the neo-fascist International. La Stampa, a newspaper in Italy, rehashed the well-known fact that SS Colonel Otto Skorzeny, the man who Hitler sent to rescue Mussolini, has been the major arms conduit to neo-fascists everywhere. Now, whenever you see the name Skorzeny, there are the descriptions of how he rescued Mussolini. Nothing about Skorzeny and the Battle of the Bulge, saying Skorzeny, the man who wore American uniforms, who worked with Fritz Kramer to kill Americans in Malmedy massacre, is the person who has these arms. It's always he rescued Mussolini. That's safe because Mussolini is dead. The article says Skorzeny brought together various groups in the 1950s to form the Malmö International, Malmö being Sweden, and Axel Wenner-Gren, a person important in armaments who armed Adolf Hitler and worked with Rudolf Hess, and the German establishment came from Sweden. And this was the beginning, actually preceded the World Anti-Communist League. This was a convention where, by this account, every fascist party, every major nationalist sect, including the infamous Ustashi, attended. The Croatian fascists that were used by Hitler against Tito, this group were well represented by almost all groups currently responsible for European terrorism. The SAM, which is the Squadre di Azione Mussolini, Mussolini's action squads, the Ordine Nuovo, the New Order, and that's Stefano Della Calle, and along with Prince Borghese, member of Permindex, the group behind the assassination of John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King. The Ordine Nero were there, the Black Order, the Corsidon, the Tyrolean, the Wallonian Nationalists, and of course this preceded the World Anti-Communist League. In Germany, matters could be under the control of the graduates of the Freikorps and the Fritz Kramers, and then out of Asia, where WACL was formed with Taiwan and South Korea and Japan, It was under the control of Charles Willoughby, a graduate of Hitler's Kriegsacademy named Mr. Wiedenbach. I have to stop now because the hour is up. Next week, I'm going to continue, as I say, with these fascist connections and how the relationship of Skorzeny and Miles Copeland and the CIA worked in Egypt. This is an article printed in 1980 about the Nazi network of Skorzeny and Egypt and the Nasser affair, making most of the Middle East into Nazi stronghold. But this hour is up, so I will stop for now. I'll be back with you to update some current news and continue on the fascist Nazi links behind the presidency of George Bush. In the meanwhile, thank you for your calls, letters, messages. I'll be in touch with a lot of you in the weeks to come or in the week. Everything right now is okay. I'm still here, and I'll be back with you. I hope I am next week. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California.